Northwest Now is supported, in part, by viewers like you. Thank you.
We've all heard the news. Corporate departures and layoffs, high-end homes for sale, lots of vacancy downtown. Conservatives say it's all in reaction to decades of exploding state budgets and the new state income tax, for now targeting millionaires, but whose current rules can be broken as easily as a pie crust, according to Senate Majority Leader Jamie Peterson. Toss in school test scores, failure on child welfare, homelessness and addiction, and the minority says enough is enough. Into this walks a small group of people forming a local version of the resistance, mirroring the national movement, but struggling against the state's long dominant progressive politics and policymaking. Conservatives going against the grain, part of the discussion next on Northwest Now.
I think the claims that millionaires are going to leave our state are like super overblown, and if the ones that leave, like bye.
That's Seattle's new socialist mayor, bidding a jaunty farewell and good luck to the region's business owners and entrepreneurs. In Washington, the conservatives are in the minority, and that hasn't been helped by a dysfunctional Republican Party that has, at times, failed to identify winning issues and field viable candidates. Gone are the moderates on both sides, both the old roadkill caucus on the Democratic side and the Dan Evans Republicans on the center right. It's resulted in an $80 billion annual budget, vastly outpacing inflation and growth. So Washington ranks dead last in the U.S. when it comes to financial reserves, with a negative outlook from Moody's, signaling that our current AAA bond rating might take a hit, and that has, of course, huge implications for the future fiscal capacity of the entire state. Meanwhile, an Association of Washington Business study reports that business expansion plans have almost stopped, and that 44% of the state's business leaders are considering moving their personal residences out of state, and 17% say they're contemplating moving their businesses too. That number almost doubling in a year. And believe me, the incentive is to underreport, because the first movers are going to get higher prices on the way out. Into this walks organizations like Let's Go Washington and the Citizen Action Defense Fund, starting with a single small step to challenge the new state income tax. Thanks for coming to Northwest Now. Great to have a conversation about the new income tax. I mean, let's face it, let's call it that, here in Washington state. And we'll go through some of the strategies and the legalities and whatnot. But I want to start with a little bit of a devil's advocate question for both of you. Jackson, start with you. You and I both know the people that are being targeted by this. Nice boat up at Cap Sandy or maybe Roach Harbor. Palm Springs, yes. Telluride, yes. Whitefish, probably. Coeur d'Alene, nice lake house. We know who that crowd is. Why not hit them with another 9.9% over $1 million? What's the problem?
Well, there's a couple problems with it. First of all, the legislature has mislabeled this tax as a millionaire's tax. This is an income tax with $1 million deductible, and you need look no further than the plaintiffs that are in our lawsuit challenging this tax to know who this affects. We have a farmer, we have a trucker, and we have a builder and their wives, and they work their fingers to the bone to provide for their families, to make sure that their employees are provided for. They work extremely hard. They are not fat cats on their yachts. They're doing the work every day. We also have several individual groups that are represented as well. We've got the Ethnic Chamber of Commerce in Seattle that represents thousands of businesses. These are folks that came to this country to work hard and live the American dream, and they're now seeing this lifetime of work potentially threatened, where they wanted to pass that on to their families and to be able to allow them to enjoy the benefits of the American dream, and they're seeing that endangered. We also have other farmers, and then two of the largest business associations in the state, the Building Industry Association of Washington, representing over 8,000 business, businesses in the home building industry, as well as the, just blanked out, the National Federation of Independent Businesses.
Yeah, NFIB. Yep.
NFIB, so small businesses, so a cross-section of industries across the state. So this is who we're fighting for. And this is about transparency too, and accountability. The Constitution says what it says. And this lawsuit is about making sure that the 100 years of precedent where the state Supreme Court has said that you can't do an income tax, that it violates the state constitution, that income is property and therefore subject to the restrictions of the tax, that is upheld, and that's what we're fighting for.
That it has to be uniform, and
it's subject to a 1% cap. So you technically can do an income tax, but the legislature doesn't want to do it. They don't want to do it in the way that would be constitutional. I'm also proud to be joined by Rob McKenna, who is a former Attorney General, Republican, as well as Phil Talmadge, who's a Democrat. He actually supports the income tax, but he says it should be done constitutionally. You need to do a constitutional amendment if you want to do it in the way that the majority wants to do.
And quick point of order, because I think you made a good point that people don't quite understand. That $1 million exemption on your tax return isn't per family, that's per individual, correct?
Correct. And so
you've got 2 LLCs or something going.
The Department of Revenue has hired 300 employees, and they're not doing it to enforce it just on the few individuals that are subject to the tax now. This is going to come for every single individual in the state. It already applies. We just have a deduction, and that can be changed with the stroke of a pen by a future legislature.
If a pie crust breaks.
Correct. I thought it was very ironic that Senator Peterson made that comment about prior legislation that they passed, and that's a pie crust promise. And I think that this current legislation represents that as well, and that's why we're fighting. Washington State has a huge economic advantage that we don't have an income tax. That's why we have this innovation economy, and we're already starting to see folks, vote with their feet. And so, they've relied on these decades of precedent. They've relied on this great economic climate that we've had here, that the legislature has slowly been chipping away at. And so this is really a last stand in why we filed this lawsuit.
Steve, same devil's advocate question for you. You're one of the plaintiffs in this litigation, correct?
I am not.
You're not.
I'm not.
Okay. Same question though. Wage slaves, why should they care whether, the guy who owns a big trucking company or sells a big practice of some kind or a surgery center or whatever it is, why do they care if he pays a few extra bucks on his $1 million+ income?
Yeah, I mean, that's the framing they're trying to establish with this. But first of all, the so-called millionaires get a vote, and they're voting with their feet. A lot of people are leaving the state. Capital flight is real. And I think, those folks that have been targeted, and the talking points that were distributed to sell this were villainize those that aren't paying their fair share. Villainize. Is that really a strategy to broaden your tax base, to villainize a small group of folks? So a lot of people are saying, hey, look, I've had enough. Capital gains tax hit me. Property taxes are high. There's a lot of other costs to live in Washington. If we're going to have California's tax policy, I might as well move to California and get their sunshine.
I would say, but the weather's so great.
Yeah, right? Well, that's it. It's like we've kind of forgot why we created a good tax environment here. Yeah. It was to attract businesses, and we've done that spectacularly.
And the other interesting thing too, people who live here have always had I've always been struck. I moved here in 1970 and have lived on and off in the state, but I've always been struck by the fact that people kind of have this view that Seattle's kind of the center of the universe here. They don't realize that 90% of the country really sees this as a remote corner of Alaska as far as they're concerned. And the idea of picking up and beating up 167 in the rain to a job in a cubicle to invent something or to create the next Amazon, maybe not. Yeah. Without the tax incentives. How important is being a tax haven to Washington State historically and going forward, do you think, Jackson?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important. As I said before, that's, I think, one of the reasons we've had Boeing and Microsoft and all of the other companies that have taken up root here for so long and created so many jobs. And so, relying on settled law, relying on the fact that we have this 100 years of precedent, that we have repeated, every time an income tax has been presented to the voters, it has been rejected. And so that is what is, that climate, the economic climate is what has allowed us to benefit in the state. And I think that there is a real danger that the legislature could kill the golden goose here and see all of that go away, and that our state will really suffer as a result.
My hunch tells me there'll be no political consequence for this. Put this to an initiative, the voters are going to reject an income tax again. I feel pretty confident of that. Why won't there be a political cost paid? Why? What's your theory? I mean, if you had the answer, of course, you'd have Kreskin's hat on. But what's your theory about why there's no political consequence for doing this kind of thing?
I think that until it hits people personally, like they feel it, the old saying that it's a recession when my neighbor loses their job, it's a depression when I lose my job.
Yeah.
I mean, it kind of applies. And so unless the company you're working for decides to move out of state, or, your member of your family decides to leave, then it becomes a lot more real for people. And until that happens, I think it's hard to translate the frustration over this policy into results that change the political landscape in the state from an elected officer standpoint.
Steve, you work with the states, I'm sure, in estate planning and whatnot. I'd like you to give me a little perspective on this. There were reductions in the B&O and sales taxes, a little rollback on the top estate tax, which was a huge deal. I mean, that's a big deal. But they rolled that back a little bit. But then came this expansion of the sales tax, the capital gains tax, the Climate Commitment Act, the real estate excise tax that was up substantially. Do those things balance each other out at all? I mean, can you make an argument, well, a few things did get rolled back a little bit, or is it no, this is so overwhelming and it affects the ownership and entrepreneurial class so deeply that there's no way to nibble around the edges of this to fix it. It's kind of an almost all or nothing deal. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think as we raised in our lawsuit, I mean, you have the issues with the fact that it violates the state constitution, the cap on, the 1% cap on property taxes, as well as the uniformity. It has to apply to everyone in the state. But also, we've raised the issue of single subject, and that's aimed at log rolling. That's aimed at transparency in the legislation, and some of the things that you've pointed out that are in there, they simply don't relate or aren't necessary to the overall goal of the bill. I think there's a little bit of a cynical ploy here. This effort to try to say, well, this is about hungry children and whether children get lunches. If the legislature wanted to fund hungry children and make sure that they had free lunches, they had $40 billion last session in which they could have made that the top priority instead of having it dependent on an unconstitutional tax that doesn't take place for 3 years. So the idea that they're going to trot out hungry children as the excuse for this, I think doesn't hold water, and I hope people see through that.
Set me straight a little bit on where the litigation stands, just a little bit of a news update here, where it is, and then I also been wondering this, why Klickitat County?
Sure. So Klickitat County was chosen in part because we are representing both the farmer I mentioned, he has property in that area, and also the Yakima and Klickitat Farm Association as well. So, again, farmers, a lot of times they've worked their lives and they want to be able to pass on their farms to the next generation, and so they are affected by this tax and certainly concerned about it being lowered and applying to lower incomes. And the current state of the litigation is we filed the suit about a month ago. We just filed an amended complaint adding that single subject argument that I just mentioned. And the state has entered their notices of appearance for their lawyers, and so we'll have an answer from them, probably have some preliminary motions back and forth, and we'd like to get this before the judge in a summary judgment motion, hopefully within the next few months.
Really, I'm surprised to hear that. I would think you'd want to slow play this a little bit to get past the Supreme Court election coming in November. The longer this can go, the more chance there is for some change on the Supreme Court when it finally works its way there, which is the goal of this whole thing. Is my strategy off, or talk to me a little bit how you guys are thinking?
Well, I do think that there is an interesting opportunity with the current election. I mean, this is the first time in state history, I believe, you've had a majority of the court as opposed to just 3 justices every 2 years that are on there. So this is a real opportunity to make sure that the justices that are up for election really reflect the will of the voters and all of that. So I'm sure, I'm sure this and many other cases will come into play as people are thinking about who to vote for in this coming election. But in terms of the overall strategy of the case, like that's, there are a lot of different factors that we take into account, and we really just want to be able to have the argument in the best position to be able to make before this particular trial judge. And so we'll take the time necessary to be able to do that.
Yeah, because I would think that at least, as they said in Dumb and Dumber, at least there's a chance. So you mean I got a chance with the new Supreme Court election. Steve, talk a little bit.
If I could push back a little bit on that. So the current Supreme Court, although there are a couple of new appointments, the last time this issue came before them was with the capital gains tax litigation 2 years ago, and a majority of the court, although they were asked to, refused to overturn that 100 years of precedent.
Okay.
So even with the current court...
So it's not as hostile as maybe we...
There's a majority that have rejected some of the same arguments that we anticipate in this case. That said, I do think that this election will be one of the most significant in the state Supreme Court elections that we've had in the state history.
Well, I think it's important also to notice the Supreme Court ruling that disallowed a referendum on this said in their decision that this is an unbroken line of precedent that they did not want to sever. You would think that same logic should apply to an income tax and income as property, which they've also had an unbroken line of precedent.
Right, since what, 1933?
1933. It's the year my family moved to Washington State. So our family has never had to pay an income tax here, and I sure don't want to start now.
Well, you make a good point, and maybe my thinking, isn't quite right on in terms of trying to slow play it. I know the Democrats slow played it a little bit to try to eat up some time for signature gathering and some of that. So, both sides have strategies they're playing. Speaking of strategy, and I'm glad you brought up the idea about the referendum, that idea is on the side. So here comes the initiative process. You guys, plus Let's Go Washington, and a lot of the usual suspects in that. Talk a little bit about the initiative process. Steve, I would guess that you'd be somebody out with all your contacts in the business community that are you already discussing this? Is what's going on with that?
And I co-chair Let's Go Washington as well. So I'm kind of the silent co-chair. Brian Haywood obviously is the guy out front and leads that, but I help advise and work behind the scenes. And so, we're out talking to the business community. And I think you touched on two important things earlier that resonate with the business community. The tax cut for businesses that's advertised in 6346.
Right.
Eliminating B&O tax for $300,000 or less grossing businesses. Think about what size of business that is. It's not super meaningful, and God bless them. I'm glad they got it.
Yeah,
but
it's not a needle mover.
$300,000. That's you maybe have 1 or 2 employees in the city of Seattle and no storefront to support a business that size.
Yeah.
So it's not really that applicable across the way. The other thing that I think we're hearing back from supporters of the initiative effort in the business communities, they want some tax certainty. You need to be able to plan for the future and how you're going to allocate capital, what your inflows are going to be, what your outflows are going to be. And when you're monkeying with tax policy every cycle, now capital gains tax, income tax, B&O tax, real estate excise tax, all these little things go into that complicated algebra equation of how you plan your future capital allocation with no certainty what the tax policy is going to look like next year, let alone this new tax this year. It's really hard for businesses to find the stability they crave to stay in the state. And that's what we're hearing repeatedly from the folks that are opposed to this.
Some recent survey data says that business owners who may not be ready to pick up and leave, although a significant percentage are thinking about it, but almost across the board, 80-something% are certainly not expanding, not investing, not doing more.
So, we're out meeting with potential contributors to the campaign effort and the signature effort. A lot of folks that I've reached out to that are fellow business owners in the Western Washington, and even yesterday we were with some in Eastern Washington, they're moving. I've had a couple of people, hey, I'm left the state. I'm sorry, I really sympathize with what you guys are up against there. I now have moved to Las Vegas. I'm moving my business to Idaho. I'm moving my business to the Midwest. Yeah. It is happening with people we all know in the business community. Yeah.
And I was going to say, this I don't want to package this as it's all about business and business people are the only consideration we have. It's not. It's average folks. It's wage W-2 workers. Yeah. But I don't think enough people make the connection between the job you have and the success of the people who are operating the businesses that you work for. There's a connection there.
Yes, that's exactly right. Well, and it's interesting. The framing is it's a millionaire's tax. There's been years of villainizing, again, large Seattle businesses that have contributed specifically to Seattle being successful. Starbucks, Amazon, Microsoft. Yet none of those are included in this tax. So the very villains that they've created as the foil in this, they escape this tax entirely. Their income's not on the chopping block because they're C corps. It's only S corps and pass-through organizations that
that shows up on your personal return.
That shows up on your personal return. But I mean, that's business income that's not cash necessarily.
No.
And so you have to go make the cash to pay the tax somehow, which means not paying your employees as much of a bonus this year, not having as generous of benefits, only increasing wages by 3% instead of 5%. Those are all the trade-offs you have to make.
So you're not buying a new car, and then the car dealer who's got lower sales plus higher tax burdens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and what happens is businesses and people that have made their money are leaving the state.
Yeah.
And the people that have brick and mortar here, they can't pick up and leave, like our family's truck dealership. We're cemented into this region. We can't just pick up that dealership and leave. Those are the businesses that are going to have to stay and then watch this tax burden be lowered and lowered to more and more people.
I mean, you end up in a wind down.
Yes.
Whether you want to be or not. Talk a little bit, Jackson. I'd like you to add a little bit too on the initiative process. What's that look like? Is the organization forming? What's in action? When can people start to see something out at the grocery store to sign? I mean, talk about that a little.
Yeah. So my organization is the Citizen Action Defense Fund. We're not actually involved in the initiative process.
Okay. Just the litigation.
Just the litigation side. We're a C3, so we're not engaged in any of the political stuff. Let's Go is. So Steve could speak a little better to that.
Yeah, so we are printing petitions right now, starting to distribute them. We've got the ballot title, and we are actively out getting our 400,000 signatures that we need by July 2nd.
Yeah. Let's go back to the litigation then. I don't want to get you in hot water with a PDC here.
Yeah, that's okay.
Good call. Don't want to get sideways there. With the litigation, and could you draw out a little bit? We've mentioned it a couple times about the fact that income is the big decision here. If I understand this, is either income is property or it's not property. I think people just assume that I want to make sure people aren't sitting there going, "What do you mean not? What is he talking about? Of course, income is my property." Talk a little bit about that and explain it to folks so when they're reading the paper or listening to other news reports, they can go, "Oh, yeah."
Yeah, the language in the Washington State Constitution is very, very broad and very, very clear that property is anything tangible or intangible. And since 1933, the first time that this came up, the state Supreme Court said, well, income falls within that very broad definition as something, tangible or intangible, and therefore it is property,
it belongs
and therefore
to you.
Subject to the requirements under Article 7. And so, that is the unbroken line of case law that we're emphasizing and that we're trusting the court will uphold.
How, and what was the argument, if you just articulate it, because I know when you make arguments in this case, what was the argument that says no, income isn't your property? How does that work?
I think there was, the last time the legislature tried to frame it, and I think part of the frustration here is that the legislature seems to be engaged in word games and semantics to try to, get around this issue.
Yeah.
Last time it was framed as an excise tax on excess income.
Wasn't that in Olympia, City of Olympia, I think it was?
City of Olympia tried that a few years ago, and that was struck down because the court applied and said, no, that doesn't fly. There was a similar argument made with regard to the capital gains tax. And so now they certainly have identified it as an income tax here. I don't think there's any disagreement about that, but they're trying to frame it as a millionaire's tax and everything else. So Olympia is more interested in playing games and trying to position it politically as opposed to following the Constitution, following the law. And that's what my organization's job is to make sure that government is held accountable and follows the rules in the Constitution like everybody else has to do.
Last 40 seconds here. How can people, I know you're not working the political side, but if people want to learn more, Jackson, about this and get some of this and read about it, where can they go?
Sure. If they'd like more information or like to make a tax-deductible donation
Yes.
to my organization, it's www.citizenaction.org, and they're welcome to check our website.
And Steve, same with you. I know Let's Go WA is
Let's
is
Go
out there.
WA is actively out getting signatures. And then if you just want to get educated on it, incometaxwashington.com has all the facts, figures, information on the lawsuit, what this tax will mean, incometaxwashington.com.
Okay.
Sorry,
perfect.
it was citizenactiondefense.org. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah. Citizenactiondefense.org.
Yes, sir.
Okay, perfect. Good. Well, great conversation, guys. We had a little education. We had a little strategy. I think we're up to speed on what it all means, and I'm really glad to be able to share this with our viewers. Thanks so much for coming.
Thanks. Great questions.
Thank you.
Nice discussion.
Progressives have a very carefully choreographed pathway to what some fear will be an increasingly broad income tax, and the first step is winning in the courts. Because of that, what may be one of the most important state Supreme Court elections in recent history for both sides is coming up in November, with 5 seats up for grabs. The bottom line, get informed about what the candidates stand for. The Supreme Court may be the last thing standing between the end of the state's entrepreneurial economy and a further descent towards insolvency as the state's liabilities rapidly outpace the ability or willingness of the ownership class and someday possibly the working class to pay for it all. I hope this program got you thinking and talking. You can find this program on the web at kbtc.org, stream it through the PBS app, or listen on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. That's going to do it for this edition of Northwest Now. Until next time, I'm Tom Layson. Thanks for watching.